Before we dive into today's terrifying tale, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to click the bell icon so you never miss a spine-chilling story. Let's get into it. The Prize Booth Doll.
It was one of those perfect Saturday afternoons when everything seemed too ordinary to be ominous. I had promised my daughter, Lily, a trip to the carnival that had set up in the center of town for the weekend. You know the kind: flashing lights, the smell of popcorn and cotton candy, the sound of distant screams from roller coasters. It was supposed to be fun, just a little break from the usual routine. We wandered through the game booths, and Lily's eyes lit up when we stopped in front of one of those ring toss games. She begged me to play, and, after some failed attempts, I managed to hook one of the rings. The booth operator, an older man with a worn-out smile, handed me the prize, a doll. It was an old-fashioned thing, like something out of a time long gone, with big glassy eyes and a lace dress that looked a little too pristine for a carnival prize. Lily squealed with excitement, clutching the doll as if it were the greatest treasure in the world. I couldn't help but smile at how happy she was, but there was something about the doll that unsettled me. Its eyes seemed too lifelike, like they were watching me. I shook the feeling off. After all, it was just a doll, right? Kids love that kind of thing. The rest of the day passed without a hitch, rides and laughs and too much cotton candy. By the time we got home, Lily was exhausted, and I helped her settle the doll on her bed before tucking her in. But as I left her room, I couldn't help but glance back at the doll. It sat there, staring out into the dim room, its expression almost different. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was just a toy. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something was watching me. My mind kept going back to that doll, its eyes, the way they seemed to follow me. I tried to sleep, but every creak of the house made me jump. I told myself it was just the house settling, or maybe the wind outside, but deep down, a part of me knew something wasn't right. I didn't realize how true that feeling would turn out to be. The next morning started off like any other. Lily was up early, already playing with her new doll in the living room. She was talking to it, like she would with any toy, her little voice carrying through the house. I smiled, hearing her laughter echo, but that strange feeling from last night lingered. I couldn't quite shake it off. As I made breakfast, I glanced over at Lily and the doll. It was sitting upright in her lap, its eyes fixed on me from across the room. For a second, I could have sworn its head had tilted slightly. I blinked, staring at it for a few more seconds, but nothing changed. It was just sitting there, exactly how it had been. "Mom, can we take Dolly to the park later?" Lily asked, snapping me out of my thoughts. "Sure, sweetheart," I replied, trying to push away the unease building inside me. Later, after we returned from the park, I told Lily to put the doll back in her room. I was trying to move on from the weird vibes I'd been getting, but the feeling of being watched had started to creep into my thoughts again. That night, after putting Lily to bed, I headed to my own room, hoping for a good night's sleep. But at around 3 a.m., I woke up with a start. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I lay there, listening, trying to figure out what had woken me up. Then I heard it, a faint giggle. It wasn't Lily's voice. It was softer, distant, like it was coming from down the hall. My heart raced, and I forced myself to get out of bed. I tiptoed toward Lily's room, terrified of what I might find. When I opened the door, Lily was fast asleep, the doll sitting next to her, its blank eyes staring straight at the ceiling. But something was different. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. Then I noticed it. The doll wasn't in the same position it had been in earlier. I was sure Lily had left it sitting on her chair before bed, but now it was next to her on the bed, almost cradling her like it had moved on its own. My pulse quickened, and I slowly backed out of the room, shutting the door behind me. I told myself it was just Lily playing before she fell asleep, but a voice in the back of my head whispered that it wasn't. That doll had moved. The next few days were more of the same. Little things, almost imperceptible, started happening around the house. I'd find the doll in different rooms, once in the living room, another time in the kitchen, even though I was certain Lily had left it in her room. And each time, those lifeless glass eyes seemed more focused, more alert. The unease was turning into something darker. I started locking my bedroom door at night, something I'd never done before. It made me feel a bit more secure, but deep down, I knew a locked door wouldn't stop whatever was going on. One evening, I found the doll sitting at the top of the stairs, staring down at me as I stood at the bottom. Lily wasn't even home. She was at a friend's for a sleepover. The doll shouldn't have been there. I hadn't touched it. I picked it up with shaking hands and shoved it back into Lily's room, closing the door quickly behind me. But even as I walked away, I felt its eyes on my back, like it was watching every step I took. That night, the giggling returned. And this time, it was louder. The giggling jolted me awake again, but this time, it wasn't distant. It was right outside my bedroom door. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the door, half expecting it to swing open on its own. The sound of that eerie, childlike laughter echoed softly in the hall, but I knew Lily wasn't home. The house felt colder, heavier, like the air itself was suffocating me. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that maybe I was still half asleep, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had to check. Grabbing my phone as a makeshift flashlight, I slipped out of bed, my feet barely making a sound on the hardwood floor. I tiptoed toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the knob. The giggling stopped, replaced by a dead silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I turned the handle slowly, my breath caught in my throat. The door creaked open, revealing the dark hallway beyond. My phone's weak light barely penetrated the shadows, casting eerie shapes along the walls. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting, listening. Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, standing perfectly still in front of Lily's door, was the doll. Its head was slightly tilted, those dead glass eyes staring straight at me, gleaming in the dim light. My pulse quickened, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. I knew I hadn't put it there. Lily was still at her friend's house. No one had touched the doll. I was certain of it. But there it was, standing upright, as if waiting for me. My hands shook as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, to run. But I had to know. I had to prove to myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. I slowly crouched down and reached out, my fingertips grazing the cold porcelain face of the doll. The moment I touched it, the temperature in the hallway seemed to drop even more, a coldness that seeped into my bones. I grabbed the doll and shoved it back into Lily's room, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I stood there, my back pressed against the door, trying to calm my racing heart. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe I was sleepwalking, or maybe Lily had moved the doll earlier and I just hadn't noticed. I kept grasping for logical explanations, but none of them felt right. I returned to my room and locked the door behind me. As I lay back in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep. I pulled the covers up to my chin like a child hiding from monsters in the dark. But deep down, I knew there was something wrong with that doll. It wasn't just in my head anymore. I must have drifted off at some point, but I woke up again just before dawn, my heart pounding with a sense of dread. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, my fingers fumbling to check the time. That's when I saw it. Propped up on the chair at the foot of my bed was the doll. It was staring at me. I didn't scream, but I couldn't move either. The doll's lifeless eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel the weight of its gaze, like it wasn't just a toy anymore. It was something else, something watching me, something waiting. And I knew, in that moment, that whatever it was, it wanted more than just to scare me. It wanted in. I blinked hard, trying to convince myself that the doll was just a figment of my imagination. Maybe it had rolled off the bed or somehow found its way to the chair during the night. I wanted to laugh it off, but the cold fear gripping my stomach made that impossible. I shot out of bed, grabbing the doll and clutching it against my chest as if it could protect me. The light from my phone illuminated the room, but even that felt weak against the darkness that surrounded me. I needed answers. I couldn't let this continue. After a few deep breaths, I decided to do some research. I grabbed my laptop and made my way to the living room, determined to find out everything I could about that doll and the strange occurrences happening around it. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting pale light through the window, but it didn't ease my sense of dread. I sat down, opened my laptop, and started typing haunted dolls into the search bar. I clicked through various articles, stories, and forums, but nothing seemed to match what I was experiencing. Then, just as I was about to give up, I stumbled upon a local news article from years ago. My heart sank as I read the headline, "Missing Girl Found After Years, but Her Doll Remains Unaccounted For." The article described a tragic case involving a little girl named Emma who had vanished during a visit to the local amusement park. They found her body weeks later, but the doll she had brought with her was never recovered. I scanned through the rest of the article, my hands trembling as I read about the mysterious circumstances surrounding Emma's disappearance. Witnesses had claimed to see a clown lurking near the park that day, and several children reported strange occurrences while playing near the funhouse, like shadows darting out of the corners of their eyes and whispers in the air. A chill ran down my spine. Emma's story tugged at my heartstrings, and I felt a profound sadness for the little girl who had lost her life so tragically. But something deeper than sympathy was beginning to stir inside me, fear and dread at what this could mean for us. That day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the doll was more than just an inanimate object. It was connected to something dark and twisted. I knew I had to confront it. The sun was fully up now, casting bright light throughout the house, but my mind was still clouded with dread. I made my way to Lily's room, heart racing, ready to confront the doll. When I opened the door, I expected the worst. But the doll was gone. I stood frozen, searching the room, desperately looking for any sign of it. My heart raced, pounding against my ribcage. Where could it have gone? I glanced around, and just then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something on the floor. It was the doll, lying face down in the hallway just outside Lily's room. As I approached, I hesitated, that instinctual fear clawing at my gut again. I bent down to pick it up, but when I reached out, I noticed something strange, a note lying beside it. I picked it up, my hands shaking as I read the words scrawled in a child's handwriting. Asterisk, help me find her. Asterisk. I felt the blood drain from my face. The world around me spun, and I stumbled back, nearly dropping the doll again. I had to get out of this house. I had to get Lily. I needed answers, and I couldn't do it alone anymore. Whatever darkness was connected to that doll was closing in on me, and I was terrified of what would happen if I didn't act fast. I grabbed my phone and dialed Lily's friend's mom, praying she would be able to keep her there a little longer. But deep down, I knew that I couldn't escape this. The doll wasn't just a toy anymore. It was a tether to something much darker. And I had to uncover the truth before it was too late. The moment I hung up the phone, a wave of dread washed over me. I could almost feel the doll's gaze piercing through me, demanding attention, waiting for the next move. I couldn't just hide from it anymore. I needed to confront whatever dark force had intertwined itself with this seemingly innocent toy. After I collected myself, I pulled the doll up to eye level. Its painted smile felt mocking, its glassy eyes staring into my soul. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, my voice shaky. "What happened to Emma?" Silence enveloped me, thick and suffocating, but then I heard it, the soft giggle again, echoing through the hallway. My heart raced, and I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I had no choice. I had to follow it. With the doll still clutched tightly in my arms, I stepped cautiously into the hallway. The sound was faint but unmistakable, guiding me toward the living room. As I approached, the giggling stopped abruptly, replaced by an unsettling stillness. I turned the corner, and my breath caught in my throat. In the middle of the living room stood a figure, a girl, about the same age as Lily, with long dark hair and a tattered dress. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and she looked directly at me with wide, empty eyes. "Help me," she said, her voice a haunting whisper that chilled me to the bone. I felt my heart drop. This was Emma. "Is it you?" I stammered, barely able to form the words. "What happened to you?" She pointed to the doll in my hands. "She won't let me go. She wants to play." Suddenly, the air around me thickened, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening as if they were alive, swirling closer to us. I could feel something dark and powerful pressing down on me, as if the very walls were closing in. The doll's grip on my reality tightened, and I realized it wasn't just a connection to Emma. It was a vessel for something far more sinister. "Please," I begged. "What do I need to do?" "Find the truth," Emma said, her voice growing fainter. "You have to let me go." With that, she dissolved into a cloud of mist, leaving behind a sense of overwhelming sorrow that weighed on my chest. I staggered back, fighting against the wave of grief that crashed over me. I had to act quickly. I remembered the newspaper article. I had to visit the park, the amusement park where Emma had disappeared. Perhaps there were still answers waiting for me there. Without a moment's hesitation, I rushed to get my keys. I needed to bring the doll, to confront whatever entity it held. I couldn't let it take anyone else. The drive to the park felt like a fever dream, each passing mile heightening my anxiety. When I arrived, the park was eerily quiet, the vibrant colors of the rides now dulled and faded in the early afternoon light. A sense of dread settled in my stomach, but I pushed through. I headed straight to the funhouse, the area that had been at the center of the stories. As I entered, the air turned cold, and the mirrors reflected my image back at me, warped and distorted. My heart raced as I stepped further inside, the shadows flickering in the corners of my vision. Suddenly, I heard it, the giggle again, this time echoing around me. The walls seemed to pulse, alive with an energy that filled me with fear. I felt drawn deeper into the maze, and I followed the sound, the doll trembling in my hands. I stumbled upon a darkened corner, and in that moment, I understood. I needed to confront whatever lay behind the doll's facade. I turned to the doll, its painted smile now twisted in the reflection of the mirrors. "I'm not afraid of you," I shouted, my voice steady. "If you want me, you'll have to face me." The laughter stopped abruptly, and a heavy silence enveloped the room. The mirrors began to ripple, and a dark figure emerged from the shadows. A clown, twisted and grinning, its eyes filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come here," it hissed, its voice echoing like a nightmare. "You should have left the doll alone." I stood my ground, gripping the doll tightly. "I know what you did. You're not going to take anyone else." With a surge of determination, I hurled the doll at the clown. It shattered against the wall, glass and porcelain exploding in a cascade of pieces. The moment it broke, a scream erupted from the clown, a sound filled with rage and agony. The mirrors shattered as the figure began to dissolve into darkness, the shadows retreating as light flooded the room. As the last remnants of the clown vanished, I felt an immense weight lift off my shoulders. I looked down at the pieces of the doll scattered on the floor, my heart still racing but filled with a sense of relief. Emma's voice whispered in the wind, "Thank you." I turned to leave, knowing that the darkness had been banished, at least for now. I stepped out of the funhouse, the sun shining bright above me, and took a deep breath. I had faced my fears, and I had won. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that some remnants of the past lingered on, waiting for another chance to emerge. I vowed to protect my family and stay vigilant, for the shadows may retreat, but they never truly disappear.
The House of Mirrors.
I've never liked mirrors. There's something unnerving about seeing yourself stare back, like you're looking at a version of yourself you can't control. But when my friends dragged me to the carnival that Friday night, I wasn't expecting anything more than the usual laughs and overpriced food. The bright lights and noisy rides were all so familiar, but then we stumbled across the House of Mirrors. It wasn't like the other attractions. The old sign creaked as it swung in the wind, the paint peeling off the words, "House of Mirrors," in faded red letters. The building looked worn, like it had been there longer than any of us had been alive. My friends, of course, thought it would be hilarious to go inside. "Come on, Emily, it's just mirrors. What's the worst that could happen?" Sarah teased, nudging me forward. I hesitated. The entrance was a gaping mouth, a part of the carnival that felt out of place, as if it didn't belong in the world of bright lights and cotton candy. But I didn't want to be the one who chickened out. So I shrugged and stepped in. Inside, the air was cold, colder than it should have been for a summer night. My breath fogged up as I walked deeper into the maze of mirrors. At first, it was fun, seeing myself stretched out, squished, and twisted in weird ways. We all laughed at how ridiculous we looked, but then something changed. I reached a part of the maze where the mirrors weren't as warped. They were clear, too clear. I stopped in front of one, catching my breath. My reflection stared back at me, perfectly still, but something wasn't right. It wasn't smiling like I was. It was just standing there, expressionless, like it was waiting for something. I blinked. My reflection didn't. The laughter of my friends faded into the background as I leaned closer, my heart pounding. I could have sworn my reflection's eyes were darker, almost hollow, like they belonged to someone else. I waved my hand in front of the mirror, trying to snap myself out of it. My reflection followed, but there was a delay, a fraction of a second where it just stared. "Emily, come on, you slowpoke." Sarah's voice echoed from deeper inside the funhouse, snapping me out of the trance. I quickly stepped back, shaking off the feeling. It was just a trick of the light, I told myself. Maybe the old mirror was distorted in a way I didn't notice. I took one last glance at my reflection before I walked away, but this time it was grinning at me. A grin that stretched too wide, too unnatural. My heart raced as I hurried to catch up with the others, but that unsettling feeling stayed with me. Even after we left the House of Mirrors, I couldn't shake the memory of that smile. It felt like it wasn't over, like something from inside that maze had followed me out. The weird feeling didn't leave me after that night at the carnival. At first, I tried to laugh it off with my friends. I even told Sarah about the creepy mirror and how my reflection had seemed off, but she just rolled her eyes. "Emily, it's a fun house. The whole point is to freak you out," she said, chuckling. "You're overthinking it." Maybe she was right. But deep down, I knew what I had seen wasn't normal. Something about the way my reflection moved, the way it watched me, just didn't feel right. I tried to forget about it, but that image of its twisted grin lingered at the back of my mind like a bad dream I couldn't shake. A few days later, I started noticing strange things. It began with small, almost unnoticeable differences. Like when I'd brush my hair in front of the bathroom mirror. At first, I didn't even realize it, but my reflection would blink just a little later than I did. It was so subtle that I thought I was imagining it. But the more I paid attention, the more I saw it. One night, I was washing my face before bed. I splashed water onto my skin and glanced up at the mirror. My reflection was there, of course, doing the same thing, but then it froze. For a moment, it didn't move. I stood there, my hands still wet, watching in horror as the version of me in the mirror just stood there, staring, while I continued to wipe my face. My heart pounded, and I stepped back. This couldn't be happening. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and told myself it was all in my head. When I looked back, my reflection was normal again. It blinked, smiled, and did everything I did. But my skin crawled with unease. It felt like a game, like my reflection was testing me, seeing if I'd notice. I tried to avoid mirrors after that. I stopped checking myself in the hallway mirror before leaving the house, and I kept my phone's front camera off as much as possible. But mirrors are everywhere, and it was impossible to avoid them completely. One morning, I was getting ready for school. I was already running late, so I didn't even think twice when I glanced at the full-length mirror in my room. But then I froze. My reflection was standing still, but it wasn't mimicking me anymore. It stood there, head tilted slightly, just watching. I blinked, my pulse quickening, and that's when it smiled. Not my usual smile. It was wide, stretched unnaturally across its face, almost as if it was mocking me. My knees felt weak as I stumbled back, grabbing the edge of my bed for support. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to calm down. "It's just stress," I whispered to myself. "You're just imagining things." But when I opened my eyes again, my reflection was still smiling, its head still tilted, as if studying me. I couldn't breathe. Without thinking, I threw a blanket over the mirror, covering it completely. The instant I did, the room felt quieter, like whatever was lurking in that mirror was gone, for now. I didn't go to school that day. I couldn't. My mind kept replaying that twisted grin, and a terrible thought crept in. What if that thing in the mirror wasn't just mimicking me? What if it was trying to become me? I couldn't stop thinking about it. Even with the mirror covered, I felt its presence lurking behind the thin fabric of the blanket. It was as if that thing, the twisted version of me, was still watching, waiting for the right moment to emerge. I couldn't explain it, but I knew that whatever was in that mirror wanted something from me. And the worst part, I didn't know how to stop it. Over the next few days, I did everything I could to avoid mirrors altogether. I brushed my teeth without looking up, dressed without glancing at the full-length mirror, and even started covering any reflective surfaces in my room. But despite my efforts, I could still feel its presence, like it was crawling just beneath the surface, waiting for me to slip up. It wasn't until I visited my friend Sarah's house that things escalated. We were hanging out in her room, talking about school, the usual stuff. I hadn't mentioned the mirror incident to her again, not after she brushed it off the first time. But being in her room, with her large vanity mirror directly in front of us, made my skin crawl. I kept my eyes focused anywhere but there, pretending to be engrossed in the conversation. The last thing I wanted was to accidentally make eye contact with my reflection, or whatever wasn't my reflection. "Are you okay, Emily?" Sarah asked, noticing my restlessness. "Yeah, I'm fine," I lied. But the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I could sense it. Something was different about the room. As she continued talking, I glanced, just for a second, at the mirror. And there it was. That smile. My reflection sat there, perfectly still, its head tilted slightly, watching us like some twisted predator. Sarah didn't seem to notice it at all. She was still chatting away, but I couldn't hear a word. My throat tightened as I stared, transfixed. This wasn't just some harmless reflection. It was alive, and it was taunting me. I stood up abruptly, my heart pounding. "I need to go to the bathroom," I mumbled, nearly stumbling over myself as I rushed out of the room. In the bathroom, I closed the door behind me and took a deep breath. There was a mirror above the sink, of course, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it. I felt nauseous, my palms sweating. What was happening to me? Was I losing my mind? A knock on the door startled me. "Emily, you okay in there?" Sarah's voice came from the other side. I splashed water on my face, trying to steady myself. "Yeah, I'm fine." But as I stood up, my eyes flicked to the mirror, just for a moment. My reflection was there, but it didn't move. It stood perfectly still, even as I wiped my face with a towel. My chest tightened with dread. This was different. It wasn't just lagging behind. It was waiting for something. I backed away from the sink, refusing to take my eyes off the mirror. My reflection stayed rooted in place, its face calm but its eyes dark, almost hollow. And then it spoke. I swear to God, it spoke. "Soon." The word wasn't loud, but it echoed through the small bathroom like a death sentence. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled out of the bathroom, barely able to breathe. I didn't tell Sarah what I saw. I couldn't. How could I explain that my reflection had spoken to me, that it was trying to take my place? She would think I was insane. But I knew the truth. I wasn't imagining things. That thing, whatever it was trying to break free. And somehow, it was getting closer to crossing over. After that day at Sarah's house, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined my reflection standing over me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I felt paranoid, on edge, as if I was constantly being watched. The worst part was that I had no idea what that thing wanted or how to stop it. At night, I started hearing noises. It was subtle at first, soft creaks and faint whispers, like someone was moving around my room while I lay there in the dark. At first, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, feeding off my fear. But the noises grew louder, more persistent, as the days went on. Footsteps, the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor, even the soft tap of fingers on glass. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I was lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, my heart pounding in my chest. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like something was pressing down on me. And then I heard it, a distinct, deliberate knock. It came from the mirror I had covered in my room. 3 slow, rhythmic taps. I sat up in bed, my skin prickling with terror. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think that whatever was in the mirror was actively trying to reach me. But the knocking continued, each tap sending a jolt of fear through me. I could feel it, lurking behind the blanket I draped over the mirror, waiting for me to acknowledge it. Emily, the voice was faint, but unmistakable. It was my voice, my reflection's voice, whispering from behind the fabric. My hands trembled as I stood up, my body moving on its own. I didn't want to go near it, but something inside me, some force I couldn't resist, pulled me toward the covered mirror. The room felt colder as I got closer, and the air seemed to hum with a strange, static-like energy. "Emily," the voice called again, more insistent this time. "Look at me." I reached out, my fingers brushing the edge of the blanket, but I stopped myself. No, I couldn't. I wouldn't. "I'm you," the voice whispered, almost soothing now. "Don't be afraid. Just look." I ripped my hand back, stumbling away from the mirror. My heart raced, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I wasn't going to fall for it. I wasn't going to let that thing out. Not tonight. Not ever. I backed into the corner of my room, pressing myself against the wall as if I could melt into it, as far away from the mirror as possible. The knocking stopped, replaced by a low, eerie hum, like something was pacing on the other side. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to listen, refusing to look. But then I heard a soft rustling. The blanket over the mirror was shifting, being pulled back slowly. My eyes shot open, and in the dim light of my room, I saw it. The blanket had fallen halfway down, revealing a sliver of the mirror. And there it was, my reflection, grinning at me from behind the glass. Only it wasn't me anymore. Its face was distorted, stretched into an impossibly wide grin. Its eyes gleamed with a sick, unnatural light. It tilted its head, that same mocking gesture I had seen before, but this time I felt it. I felt it pulling at me, trying to draw me into the mirror. "No," I whispered, backing further into the wall. "No. Leave me alone." But it didn't stop. Its grin widened, its eyes narrowing with a malicious intent. And then it spoke again. "Soon," it said, its voice a twisted echo of my own. "Very soon." The blanket fell completely, and my reflection stood there, grinning, watching, as I trembled in the corner of the room. There was no escaping it. It had crossed a line, and now I knew it was only a matter of time before it found a way to take my place. I didn't leave my room for days. I barely ate, barely slept. Every moment I spent away from the mirror, I felt like I was running out of time. I could feel it, the pull, the force of that thing trying to take over my life, trying to become me. I knew it wouldn't stop until it succeeded, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold it back. I tried everything. I covered the mirror again, but it didn't matter. Even with the blanket over it, I could hear it, whispering, calling my name, begging me to look. I smashed the smaller mirrors in the house, but it seemed to follow me everywhere. In reflections in windows, in the surface of my phone, in puddles of water. No matter what I did, there it was, grinning, mocking, waiting. Then came the night that changed everything. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I had barricaded myself in my room, wedged a chair under the doorknob like it would somehow protect me from whatever was coming. The mirror sat on the other side of the room, covered in that now familiar blanket. The air was cold, so cold that I could see my breath, and the room felt wrong, like the walls were closing in, like something was watching me from every corner. Suddenly, the knocking started again. 3 sharp taps. I flinched, but I didn't move. I wouldn't give in. Not this time. But the knocking didn't stop. It grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was behind the glass was furious, desperate. The voice followed. "Emily, let me out." I shook my head, pulling my knees to my chest, whispering to myself, "You're not real. You're not me. You can't hurt me." But the voice only grew stronger, more insistent. "I'm so close. Just look at me. Let me take your place. I belong here now." I covered my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was inside my head, echoing with every beat of my heart. I couldn't escape it. My hands were trembling, my breath coming in shallow gasps. And then, the blanket slowly began to slide off the mirror, by itself. "No," I whispered, panic flooding through me. "Please, no." The blanket hit the floor with a soft thud, and there it was. My reflection. But this time, it wasn't just standing there. It was moving. The version of me in the mirror was pacing, its grin twisted into something far more menacing, more animalistic. Its eyes burned with a dark intensity, as if it was ready to pounce. It stopped pacing, and in a heartbeat, it pressed its hands against the glass, leaning closer, as if trying to push through. "I'm ready," it said, its voice now low and dangerous. "You're too weak. You can't keep me out." I scrambled to my feet, my back against the wall, trying to think. My heart pounded so loud in my ears, I could barely hear my own thoughts. What was I supposed to do? Break the mirror? Run? But deep down I knew. This wasn't just about the mirror anymore. It was about me. It was already inside, already clawing its way into my world. The reflection's hands pressed harder against the glass, and I saw the surface ripple like water. My breath caught in my throat. It was coming through. "I'll live your life better than you ever could," it sneered, its voice dripping with venom. "Say goodbye, Emily." I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the nearest object, a small lamp, and hurled it at the mirror with everything I had. The mirror shattered with an ear-splitting crash, pieces of glass flying everywhere. I shielded my face, but when I opened my eyes again, the reflection was gone. The mirror, once whole, was now in shards on the floor. But something felt off. The room was still cold, the air thick with that dark, oppressive presence. I turned around slowly, and there it was. The reflection wasn't in the mirror anymore. It was in the room. The twisted version of me stood there, grinning wickedly, its eyes gleaming with triumph. It had crossed over. The mirror had only been the doorway. Before I could react, it lunged at me, its hands closing around my throat. I gasped, struggling, but its grip was too strong. My vision blurred, the room spinning as I fought for air. This was it. It had won. But in a last surge of desperation, I reached for one of the shards of broken glass, gripping it tightly in my hand. With all the strength I had left, I drove it into its side. It let out a horrible scream, a sound that was both mine and not mine, and staggered back, its form flickering like a dying light bulb. I fell to the floor, gasping for air as it writhed, twisting in agony. And then, with a final blood-curdling shriek, it dissolved into nothing. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the spot where it had stood, my body trembling, my mind reeling. It was over. The reflection was gone. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that it's not truly gone. I still avoid mirrors. I still see movement out of the corner of my eye. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear it. A faint whisper. Soon.
The clown in the photo.
It all started with something as simple as cleaning out the attic. I wasn't expecting to find anything significant, just the usual forgotten relics of the past. Old boxes, dusty furniture, maybe some photo albums. My wife had been after me for months to clear out the clutter, and I finally gave in. I wish I hadn't. While rummaging through an old trunk that probably hadn't been opened in years, I found a stack of photos wrapped in a brittle, yellowing newspaper. Curiosity got the better of me, so I sat on the floor and started flipping through them. Most of the pictures were from my childhood, birthday parties, family vacations, things I hadn't thought about in decades. Then, I found it. It was an old photo of me and my parents at a park. I must have been around 7 or 8 years old, grinning wide, holding a balloon in one hand and my mom's hand in the other. My dad stood proudly beside us, smiling like life couldn't be better. The backdrop was familiar. The Ferris wheel, the carnival games, the bright colors. It was a snapshot of pure joy. But something wasn't right. Behind us, just out of focus, stood a figure. At first, I didn't pay much attention to it. But the longer I looked, the more it stood out. It was a clown. Not the cheerful, funny kind you see at parties. This one was different. Its face was painted stark white, with hollow black eyes and a smile that stretched too wide, almost like it was carved into its face. The clothes were tattered, stained in places, and the hat it wore seemed worn, like it had been through too many rainy days. I stared at the clown, my fingers running over the faded image. I didn't remember ever seeing a clown that day. In fact, I didn't remember any clown at all from my childhood. But there it was, looming in the background of what should have been a happy memory. A chill ran down my spine as I continued to study the photo. There was something wrong about that clown, something unsettling, like it wasn't supposed to be there. My stomach churned as I realized that, despite the playful setting, the clown wasn't smiling with joy. It was watching me. Its eyes, though blurry, seemed locked on me in the picture, as if it knew I'd find it all these years later. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just a trick of memory, or maybe even a random carnival performer who happened to wander into the shot. Still, that night I couldn't get it out of my head. Before heading to bed, I placed the photo back in the box and stuffed it into the corner of the attic, trying to forget the disturbing face of the clown. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the image from my mind. The way it seemed to be watching me, waiting. I told myself it was just a photo, nothing more. But deep down, I felt that cold, creeping sense of unease that something wasn't quite right. I should have thrown that picture away the moment I found it. But it was too late for that. After finding that photo, the thought of the clown lingered in my mind like a bad dream. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was just an overreaction. It had to be. Maybe it was just a random performer in the background. Maybe I'd seen too many horror movies and was letting my imagination get the best of me. But the uneasy feeling stayed with me. A few days later, my wife suggested we take our daughter to the park for the weekend. It was a family-friendly spot, with rides, games, and the usual carnival atmosphere. I hadn't been there in years, but the name of the park stuck with me, the same place from the photo. A shiver ran down my spine at the coincidence. I didn't tell my wife about the photo or the clown, though. It seemed silly to bring it up. I agreed to go, thinking it might even help me get over the irrational fear that had taken root in my head. It was just a park, after all. When we arrived, the first thing that hit me was how much had changed. The old ticket booth was replaced by a modern one, and a lot of the attractions had been upgraded. But some things hadn't changed at all. The same Ferris wheel stood in the distance, the same brightly colored tents lined up along the midway. It was like stepping into a strange blend of the past and present, and it brought back memories of that day with my parents. Memories that, until I found that photo, had been buried deep. As we walked through the park, I found myself scanning the crowd, my eyes darting from one performer to the next. There were clowns, of course. Kids were laughing as they twisted balloons into animals and did silly tricks. But none of them looked like him. None of them had that same unsettling face, that vacant stare. At least, not at first. We passed by a game booth, one of those where you have to throw a ball at stacked bottles to win a prize. As my daughter tugged on my hand, begging to play, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. Standing near the edge of the crowd, half in shadow, was a clown. My heart skipped a beat. The face was painted white, the eyes dark and hollow, the smile stretched unnaturally wide. It was him, the clown from the photo. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He was watching me, just like in the picture. I blinked, trying to convince myself it was just another park performer. But something was off. He didn't move, didn't interact with anyone. He just stood there, staring at me. "Dad, are you okay?" My daughter's voice snapped me back to reality. I shook my head, trying to push the image of the clown out of my mind. "I'm fine, sweetie," I muttered, my voice not sounding as steady as I'd hoped. "Let's go play the game." We spent the rest of the day going from ride to ride, and I did my best to focus on my family and not let my paranoia get the better of me. But every now and then, I would catch a flash of white makeup, a glimpse of that wide smile in the distance. It was never clear enough to be sure, but the feeling was unmistakable. He was still watching. By the time we left the park, I was exhausted, both mentally and physically. I didn't tell my wife what I had seen. She'd just think I was imagining things. But deep down, I knew it wasn't in my head. That night, I lay awake in bed, my mind replaying the day's events over and over. I kept seeing his face in the shadows, his eyes fixed on me. What disturbed me most wasn't just the fact that I had seen him again. It was the growing sense that he wasn't just a performer or a forgotten memory from the past. He was something more, and whatever he was getting closer. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the clown's face. That pale, stretched smile. Those black, hollow eyes. I tossed and turned, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a clown from a carnival, a trick of my mind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At around 2 a.m., I heard a noise. It wasn't loud, just a soft rustling, like the sound of fabric brushing against something. At first, I thought it was my wife shifting in her sleep, but when I listened closer, I realized it was coming from outside. My heart started to pound as I sat up in bed, staring at the window. The room was dark, but the faint glow of the street lamp outside cast shadows on the curtains. I listened, straining to hear anything else. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of my own breathing. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate scraping sound, like someone dragging something along the wall outside the house. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. I told myself it was probably just the wind, maybe a branch brushing against the siding. But deep down, I knew better. The sound was too intentional, too controlled. Carefully, I slipped out of bed and moved toward the window. My hands shook as I pulled back the curtain just a few inches, just enough to see outside. The street was empty, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Nothing seemed out of place. But then I saw him. Standing at the edge of the yard, barely visible in the dim light, was the clown. His body was partially hidden in the shadows, but I could see the pale outline of his face. His eyes were locked on me, just like in the photo, just like at the park. That same twisted grin stretched across his face, as if he were silently laughing at me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to scream, to wake my wife, to do something, but I couldn't move. All I could do was stare back at him, my heart racing. After what felt like an eternity, he took a step forward. That was when I snapped out of it. I let the curtain fall back and stumbled away from the window, nearly tripping over myself in the process. I rushed to the bedroom door, locking it in a panic, my hands trembling so badly that I could barely grip the knob. I leaned against the door, trying to calm down, telling myself I had imagined it, that it wasn't real. But I knew what I had seen. He was there, he was real, and he was getting closer. For the rest of the night, I stayed awake, my eyes fixed on the window, waiting for the sound of footsteps, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I was exhausted, my mind foggy from lack of sleep. When my wife woke up, she asked if I was feeling okay. I lied, saying I just had trouble sleeping. I couldn't tell her about the clown. Not yet. It sounded too insane, even to me. But I couldn't ignore what I had seen. He had followed me, from the photo to the park to my house. And I had the horrible, creeping feeling that this was just the beginning. As the day wore on, I tried to go about my routine as usual. I went to work, I took care of my daughter, but every time I passed a window or caught a reflection in a mirror, I found myself looking for him, expecting to see that pale face lurking in the distance. I didn't see him again that day, but the fear gnawed at me, growing stronger with each passing hour. That night, as I prepared for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My skin prickled, and every creak of the house seemed amplified. I kept glancing toward the window, dreading what I might see. I told myself it was all in my head. That's what had to be happening. But even as I said it, I knew I didn't believe it. I knew he was still out there. And the worst part, he was getting bolder. The next few nights were unbearable. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel him out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. It didn't matter if I pulled the curtains shut, turned off every light, or even tried to drown out the thoughts with the TV. The clown was always in my mind, hovering just beyond the edge of reason. Sleep came only in fragments, but even then, it was filled with nightmares. Nightmares of that pale, grinning face. On the fourth night, something changed. It was around midnight, and I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again, the soft rustling outside. My body went cold instantly, and I knew, without a doubt, that he was back. My wife was sound asleep beside me, unaware of the growing terror I was living with. I didn't want to wake her, I didn't want her to think I was losing my mind. But I had to see. I had to know if he was really there or if this was all just in my head. I crept out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and moved toward the window. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it would wake her, but somehow she didn't stir. I reached for the curtain, my hand trembling, and slowly pulled it back just enough to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. He was closer. So much closer. The clown was standing on the front lawn, directly in front of the house. His face was partially illuminated by the faint glow of the street lamp, and for the first time I could see him in detail. His makeup was cracked, as if it had been painted on decades ago and left to decay. His eyes, those black, empty eyes, bore into mine like he could see straight through me. And that smile, it was wider now, more grotesque, stretching too far across his face, as if the very sight of my fear was amusing to him. My breath caught in my throat. He was just standing there, motionless, staring up at me like he had all the time in the world. I backed away from the window, trying to keep myself from making a sound. My legs felt like jelly, and I stumbled as I moved toward the door, my mind racing. This wasn't just a figment of my imagination. He was real. He was outside my house. I grabbed my phone, my hands shaking, and dialed 911. It felt ridiculous. I was about to tell the police that a clown was standing outside my house, watching me. But this was beyond rational now. I needed help. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, routine. I hesitated for a second, unsure of how to even explain this. There's someone outside my house, I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. A man. He's dressed as a clown. He's been watching me for days. There was a pause on the other end, like the dispatcher was trying to process what I had just said. A clown, she repeated, her tone skeptical. Yes, a clown, I insisted, my voice cracking with fear. He's standing in my yard right now. He's been following me, I think. A loud bang from downstairs cut me off. My blood turned to ice as I realized what had just happened. He wasn't just standing in the yard anymore. He was inside the house. He's here, I whispered, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. He's inside. The dispatcher's voice immediately became more urgent. Sir, stay calm. Officers are on their way. Lock yourself in a room if you can, and stay on the line. I didn't wait for her to finish. I sprinted to the bedroom door, locking it with shaking hands before grabbing my wife and shaking her awake. What's going on? She mumbled, confused and groggy. He's inside, I whispered, my voice barely audible. The clown. He's inside the house. Her eyes widened in disbelief, but the fear in my face must have convinced her that this wasn't some nightmare or hallucination. I motioned for her to stay quiet, and we both stood frozen, listening. There was another bang from downstairs, this time louder, like something heavy had been knocked over. Footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, echoing through the silence of the house. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The fear was paralyzing. The footsteps were getting closer, heading up the stairs. My wife grabbed my arm, her grip tight with panic. What do we do? She mouthed, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't have an answer. All I could think about was those empty eyes, that horrible grin, and the fact that he was now inside my home. The footsteps stopped just outside the bedroom door. I held my breath, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. For a few agonizing seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, deliberately, the handle of the door began to turn. The door handle turned slowly, each creak cutting through the silence like a blade. My wife clung to my arm, her eyes wide with terror, while my heart pounded so violently that I thought it would burst from my chest. We were trapped, helpless, and the clown, that thing, was just on the other side of the door. I stared at the handle, waiting for it to give way, waiting for him to step into the room. My mind raced through impossible scenarios, each one worse than the last. What would we see when the door opened? Would he have that same twisted grin? Would he finally speak? Suddenly, the handle stopped turning. The silence was suffocating. I held my breath, afraid to make the slightest sound. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard the softest, most chilling noise I could imagine. Breathing star. Slow, steady, and far too close. I gripped my phone tighter, pressing it against my chest. The dispatcher was still on the line, though her voice seemed so distant now. The footsteps, the noise, the breathing, everything was too real, too close. I had no idea what to do. Was it better to wait and hope he would leave, or open the door and face whatever was waiting? And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the breathing stopped. I didn't dare move. I waited, barely blinking, every muscle in my body tense, expecting the worst. But the next few seconds dragged on into what felt like hours, and the house had fallen back into an eerie, oppressive silence. I finally exhaled, my breath shaky. My wife's grip on my arm loosened, and she looked at me with desperate, questioning eyes. "Is he gone?" she whispered. I didn't know. My instincts told me to stay put, to wait for the police, but the other part of me, the irrational, desperate part, needed to know. I needed to see if he was still out there. I needed to prove that I wasn't losing my mind. I motioned for her to stay back, and, with trembling hands, I unlocked the bedroom door as quietly as I could. The hallway was pitch dark, save for the faint moonlight seeping through the window at the end of the hall. I held my breath and listened again, waiting for some sign of movement. Nothing. Not a single sound. Slowly, I crept out of the bedroom, my heart hammering in my chest. I tiptoed toward the top of the stairs, peering down into the darkness below. I half expected to see him standing there, his grinning face looking up at me from the bottom of the stairs. But the hallway was empty. No sound, no movement. I made my way downstairs, gripping the banister so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The air felt heavy, thick with dread, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, my phone buzzed, an incoming message. I unlocked it with shaky fingers, and a wave of cold terror washed over me. It was a photo. The clown, standing in my yard, grinning up at my house. The timestamp showed that the picture had been taken just moments ago. I dropped my phone, the sound echoing loudly through the house. My skin prickled with fear, my vision blurring as panic overtook me. He wasn't gone. He was still here, watching, waiting. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the front door. I nearly jumped out of my skin. My first thought was that it was the police, finally arriving to help. I stumbled toward the door, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I reached for the doorknob. But before I could open it, a thought hit me. What if it's him? I froze, my fingers hovering over the lock. Another knock, this time louder, more insistent. My mind was spinning. I didn't know what to do. The fear was too overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at me not to open the door. I backed away slowly, retreating to the shadows of the hallway. The knocking stopped. Silence again. I waited, tense and motionless, listening for any sign of movement outside. And then I heard it, a voice, muffled, but unmistakable. "Sir, this is the police. We're here to help." Relief flooded through me. My legs almost gave out as I scrambled back to the door and unlocked it with trembling hands. When I pulled it open, 2 uniformed officers stood on the porch, looking concerned. "He's here," I blurted out, my voice shaky. "The clown. He's been following me. He's still out there." The officers exchanged glances, and one of them stepped forward. "We'll take a look around," he said calmly. "But I need you to stay inside for now." They moved cautiously around the yard, shining their flashlights into the darkness. I stood in the doorway, watching them, barely able to breathe. Every second felt like an eternity as I waited for them to find him, to end this nightmare. But after what felt like hours, they returned, their expressions grim. "We didn't find anyone," one of the officers said. "No sign of a clown, or anyone else for that matter." I shook my head, refusing to believe it. He was right there. I saw him, and the photo. "He's in the photo." The officer looked at me carefully, then at the phone in my hand. "Sir, let's take a look at that photo." I unlocked my phone, my fingers trembling as I opened the message again. I handed it to the officer, watching his face closely for a reaction. But when he looked at the screen, his brow furrowed in confusion. "There's nothing here," he said, turning the phone toward me. The photo was gone. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The image, the one that had just shown the clown in my yard, wasn't there anymore. It had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. My heart dropped into my stomach. Had I imagined it? Was this all in my head? The officers were speaking, asking me questions, but their voices faded into the background. All I could think about was that smile, that awful, knowing grin. And somewhere, deep down, I knew that the clown wasn't finished with me yet. This was just the beginning.